Um, and we're very excited tonight for, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you what's coming up. I'm not going to actually go through it all because you can go right to our Facebook page and find it. But we've got some great programs coming up over the next, 3 or 4 months. So please check back if you'd like to be on our mailing list. Put your email address in the chat as well, and I'll sign you up and you'll get all that information. Okay, so tonight we have got Catherine Smith with us. She is an author, a journalist, a writer, an American history speaker. She's given her presentation at the FDR Library, the National World War II Museum. She's written countless books, and she's got a brand new book coming out that she's very excited about. But tonight, we are actually going to spend the evening with Miss Margaret LeHand. So please sit back and enjoy the presentation.
Hello, I'm on. It's so lovely to be with all of you. And I see that a lot of you are very shy and have just got your names. And if you don't feel uncomfortable, let's see what you look like. It helps me to know if you're hearing me and if I'm getting through and I'm making you laugh, because that's very important to me. I'm known for my sense of humor. Anyway, I always enjoy an opportunity speaking in my adopted home state. I am actually from New York State originally, but I spent most of my youth in the Boston area, so I definitely consider myself a Bay State girl. So I'm going to be sharing greetings to you from President and Mrs. Roosevelt today. They send their best wishes from the White House. But I thought that I might tell you a little bit about myself and how I became the first woman secretary of a president of the United States. Now, looking at the names, the surnames that came up as you were all filing into the chat room, I saw a lot of names that struck me as perhaps being Irish. So, do we have any people in this room who have Irish ancestry? Did you raise your hands? Oh, I thought so. Well, perhaps like me, you had ancestors who came over to America during the potato famine of the 1840s, which is when my grandparents came over on both sides. It was a terrible time for the Irish. Anyone who could get out of the country did, or died trying, and many of them died on the way over in these terrible leaky boats they called coffin ships, because so many people perished on the way over and were just tossed overboard into the ocean. Well, my grandparents, my LeHand grandparents, my father's parents arrived here, and they were married, had my father, Daniel, and then they settled in Potsdam in upstate New York. And my grandfather, Daniel, was working on a project. He was building a roof at the Methodist church, and a hatchet fell on his head and killed him. My poor grandmother never remarried, so that made my father quite an unusual creature, an only child in an Irish Catholic family. He married my mother, Mary, also the child of immigrants, and they had their little family in Potsdam. I'm the youngest. I'm the youngest of 4 children. And when I was a very small child, my family relocated to the Boston area, to a section of Boston known as Somerville. Somerville is a blue-collar, working-class town. You've probably never heard of it unless you've got relatives there, but there are lots of Irish people, lots of Italians, some Greeks, and we fit in quite well there. My father, well, we like to say he was in real estate, but actually he was a gardener, so he had the real estate under his fingernails for the most part. And unfortunately, he drank a little, so my mother would sometimes take in Harvard students as boarders, because Harvard was right there next to Somerville. Now, you may know that a certain person in the White House was a student at Harvard, a certain Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But obviously his mother made other arrangements for him, so he didn't have to be put up in my mother's spare bedroom. So I didn't meet him then. So I went to the public schools there in Somerville. I studied all the usual subjects, plus a good deal of secretarial sciences, uh, shorthand and typing and office management and that kind of thing. Knowing that I would have to make my own way in the world, earn a living. And to be honest, there were only three things that a woman could do then. You could be a teacher, and children made me nervous, or you could be a nurse, and blood made me sick. So there was the last resort was secretary, and I did have some good aptitude in that area. So when I graduated from the high school in 1917, we had just entered the Great War, and I was wanting to do my bit for my country. So I took the civil service exam, and I was sent to Washington, D.C. to work in the Department of the Navy. Now, there was a certain Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was at that time the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, serving under Josephus Daniel. Mr. Daniel was from North Carolina. He was a newspaper publisher, very big wheel in the Democratic Party, knew absolutely nothing about the Navy. He called all ships boats, and he really needed some help in that area. So fortunately, he brought in Mr. Roosevelt as his assistant, and Mr. Roosevelt has grown up around the sea and ships and boats all his life. He was very knowledgeable. He was a great authority on naval history, and he had handled sailboats ever since he was a very small child. Well, that was good, and that allowed Mr. Daniel to pursue his chief interest as Secretary of the Navy, which was abolishing sin. And if you've ever met a sailor, you knew that that was a very tall order. But he did his best. The first thing he did was to ban any beverage stronger than coffee from all the Navy bases and even the officers' mess. And that is why, to this day, we refer to a cup of coffee as a cup of Joe, after Josephus Daniels. Well, when I was working at the Department of the Navy, we were at war, and I was in an area of great top secrecy. I was down there in the stenography pool, and all day long, we would be given successive sheets of paper to transcribe from the stenography, from the little squiggles of shorthand, and then type. Well, because of the secrecy and because they didn't really trust us, the sheets of paper never had anything to do with each other. So I would type a sheet, and then I was given another one that had nothing to do with the one before, and so on all day long. I would go home at the end of the day, my fingers aching, my shoulders aching, a terrible headache, and I had no idea what I had done all day. Well, I stayed at a boarding house with a friend who also worked in the stenography pool. And one day, a beautiful spring day, much like this one, we decided to play hooky. We sent word to the office that we were sick, and we went off to visit the home of the father of our country, George Washington, at Mount Vernon. And we had a wonderful time until we got home. There was a Navy nurse sitting on the doorstep, and she said, "You don't look sick to me." Oh, we got into terrible trouble. We were both sent to the Navy doctor, had to have physicals, and my friend got into all sorts of trouble because she didn't have anything wrong with her. Now, he detected in me a heart murmur, which I had developed as a child when I had rheumatic fever. So it was suggested that perhaps I needed to be sent to a job that was not quite as strenuous. So they sent me up to Philadelphia, and I worked for the emergency shipping board until the end of the war. Well, in 1920, I got a letter from a Mr. Charles McCarthy, who I'd met at the Navy Department, and wanting to look after another good Irish person, I suppose. He sent me word that he was the secretary on the campaign of a certain Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was running for vice president of the United States with Governor Cox, with the Democratic nominees. And he needed some help at the office in Manhattan. and I wondered if I might come and help out for a few months. Well, I had a cousin who lived in the Bronx, so I agreed, sure, I would come and sleep on the cousin's couch and catch the subway and the elevated rail all the way down to the headquarters building. That was 23 or 24 subway stops. I haven't counted. But it was very exciting. And it was a very interesting race. I did not see much of Mr. Roosevelt because he was whistle stopping across the country, both him and Mr. Cox, giving speech after speech after speech and trying to win the contest. But it was a very bad year to be a Democrat. We had just gotten out of the Great War. Everyone was sick of the war, sick of rationing, sick of Woodrow Wilson and his League of Nations, and we just really didn't have much of a platform to stand on. And that's how we wound up with the president we got, Warren G. Harding, and his vice president, the very colorless former governor of the Bay State, Calvin Coolidge. Okay, now I know I'm partial to Democrats, and since you live in Massachusetts, I think you probably are too, but I have to say, Mr. Harding was the worst president in U.S. modern history until quite recently. The scandals that erupted after his administration was 3 years old. There was the Teapot Dome scandal with the oil leases and the corruption. And fortunately, Mr. Harding picked that time to go off to Alaska and have a heart attack and die. There were some people who said his wife did it, but I just don't believe that. Anyway, so he came home across the country, everyone crying and mourning, and then the scandal started leaking out. And by the time his tomb was dedicated just a few years later, Mr. Herbert Hoover, who was by then the president, didn't even show up for the dedication. But anyway, I guess I should say a few words about Mr. Coolidge also. He came into power after 3 years, and he pretty much cleaned up his office, the office of the presidency, by doing nothing. He went into the White House, pulled down the shades, and slept for 5 years. He was known as Silent Cal. Once a woman was at a dinner party at the White House and said she had bet a friend that she could make him say more than 2 words. He looked at her and said, "You lose." I suppose I shouldn't speak badly of him. He did pass away a few years ago. How they could tell, I don't know. But anyway, back to Mr. Roosevelt. He knew it was going to be quite a long time before he could have a good chance to run for president because the Republicans had a lock on the White House. So he decided in 1921 to go into the public sector, to start a law firm in New York, and to also work for a bonding company. By then, I had come to work with him and Mrs. Roosevelt up at Hyde Park, just handling some of the correspondence from the campaign. And we got along so well, he asked me if I would come to work for him as his private secretary. Well, I don't know if there are any lawyers in the room or any retired lawyers or anyone who has children or other relatives who are lawyers. Please don't take this the wrong way. But I said, I don't think I want to work for a lawyer, Mr. Roosevelt. I find the work so dull. Well, he said to me, "Oh, Missy." Okay, I guess I should explain about how I went from being Marguerite to Missy. The younger Roosevelt children had a hard time saying Miss LeHand, and it just kind of slurred until it became Missy LeHand, and before long, everyone called me Missy. So Mr. Roosevelt said, "Oh, Missy, don't you worry. I find the law work pretty boring myself. There'll be lots of other things to do." And he was correct because he was very active with the Boy Scouts, with the Woodrow Wilson Institute, and of course he was trying to resuscitate the dead Democratic Party. So he had correspondence going on with people all over the country. I came to work for him in January, and we got along so well, and I was getting so good at the law work, I started getting letters addressed to Marguerite LeHand, Esquire. Well, all of that came to a halt in the summer of 1921. Mr. Roosevelt joined his family for a vacation at their home on Campobello Island. Campobello Island off the coast of Maine. It's actually part of Canada. And there he was stricken with poliomyelitis. We often call it infantile paralysis or the infantile because it usually strikes children, but that's a pretty hard pill to swallow when you are a grown adult, 39 years of age, and stand 6'2". At least he did before his legs gave way. And over the next few years, Mr. Roosevelt did everything he could to try to walk again. He tried every kind of therapy, conventional and some of them pretty strange, and he was having no luck until the summer of 1924. He went to the Democratic Party convention, and there he ran into an old Harvard classmate, George Foster Peabody. Mr. Peabody was from Columbus, Georgia, and he owned an old resort in the town of Bullockville, Georgia, called the Meriwether Inn. It was built on some warm water springs, and it had been a very popular place for Victorians to go to take the waters, as they said. But it was falling on hard times, as much of Georgia had itself. But what intrigued FDR was that this Mr. Peabody said that a young man who was a polio patient, a survivor, had gone and swam and exercised so long in the pools that he was able to walk with just a cane. It had strengthened his legs enough that he could walk with just a cane. Well, that was all he needed to hear. He decided to go and find out for himself. So he packed me and his wife Eleanor and a young man named Roy, who was his valet, helped him get about and the like. And we went all the way from New York to the piney woods of Georgia. Well, it was quite a shock. The 20s were roaring for much of the country, but not for Georgia. The Cotton Bowl had taken over. It had destroyed the cotton fields. It was a very poverty-stricken area. And when we got down there, we discovered that the little town, which had recently renamed itself Warm Springs, was 10 miles from the nearest paved road. There was not much phone service, not very good electrical service, very spotty, in fact, and even a lot of the homes had no indoor plumbing. So we came upon this rather grim little town, and Mrs. Roosevelt, who's always one to do the best she could, did her best for a few days, but really she was struggling with it. The racism there was so overt, and she is so tender-hearted and so egalitarian, so that was difficult. But I have to say, the final straw was
Can
the
I
day we
interrupt
went
you
to get
real
some
quick?
chickens for supper and discovered we had to buy them on the hoof.
Catherine, this is your
Well, we
husband.
bought those chickens back in the car, clucking
Catherine,
and
this is your
squawking,
husband,
and handed them
FDR.
to the cook, Daisy Bonner, who prepared them for dinner. Having witnessed the chicken execution, Mrs. Roosevelt had a very hard time eating her dinner. In fact, she couldn't take a bite of the chicken. She said it was just too personal. And the next morning, as we were having our coffee, she said to me, "Oh, Missy, suppose Franklin asks for steak for dinner tonight. Whatever shall I do?" I suppose she thought we would just slaughter a cow out in the yard. Okay, I made that part up about the steak. Not true, but the chickens were true. And Mrs. Roosevelt did have so much to occupy her, so she got back on the train and went back up to New York to participate in her many political causes and to look after her 5 children. Now, Mr. Roosevelt and I, meanwhile, and Roy stayed behind, and he exercised every day in those warm water pools. He could feel differences immediately. He could feel his toes move. He could stand on his own in the pool with just a little bit of support, moving his hands back and forth in the water. The first time he'd stood on his own 2 feet in 3 years. And he could even take a few steps if he held onto the rope that crossed the pool. He gave an interview to a reporter from the Atlanta Journal saying that he planned to swim his way back to health. Well, we packed up and went back north for the winter, and when we returned the following March, there were a bunch of polio patients waiting. They had read the article, which was syndicated across the country, and they decided they wanted to swim their way back to health too. Well, there were no doctors there. There were no nurses. There was just me, and Mr. Roosevelt didn't stop him. He just styled himself Old Doc Roosevelt, promoted me to Nurse LeHand. Thank God the statute of limitations is run out on that one. But we got in the pool with those patients and we just helped them as best they could to exercise the muscles that still worked, to get some fresh air. And in the off hours, we did we created what we called the warm spring spirit. It was a spirit of optimism, of can do, of supporting each other. We had a lot of fun out there. We had bridge parties, we had lots of games, we had contests, we had square dancing. We had these funny skips that we put on. And ladies, you have not laughed until you've seen a bunch of gentlemen in tutus and leg braces do a can-can together. Well, things were going so well that Mr. Roosevelt bought the place, turned it into a private foundation, and many of his well-to-do friends in the North, like Edsel Ward, began sending donations to restore the place, to build a covered pool, to rehabilitate the cottages, which I had to say were in pretty sorry condition, and bring in real medical staff to work with the patients. Well, in 1928, just when I thought Mr. Roosevelt was this close to being able to walk again, he got a call. It was from the Democratic Party in New York, from Al Smith, who was running for president on the Democratic ticket. They were begging him to run for governor of New York. Well, I stood at his elbow saying, "Don't you dare, FD. Don't you dare, FD." But he did, and he did, and he got elected by a whisker. Well, Al Smith lost the election, and that's when Herbert Hoover came into office. Well, Mr. Roosevelt took office in January of 1929. By then, I'd gone north to Albany, and Mrs. Roosevelt invited me to come and live with them at the governor's mansion. She was teaching in a school in New York 3 days a week, and she loved it so much, she made arrangements for me to be her backup hostess at the governor's mansion, as well as FDR's secretary, and then she would take the train to Manhattan, teach, and come back on Wednesday nights. Um, so it was a very busy time. And then in March of that year, Mr. Herbert Hoover took office. He had run, it was a ticket that I don't know that he made up the theme, but he certainly cashed in on it, of a chicken in every pot. Ha, you should have heard Mrs. Roosevelt on that one. But he promised that the end of poverty was within sight. Well, you know what happened just a few months after that. In October of 1929, the stock market crashed, and that was the beginning of this Great Depression that we are still mired in. Well, Mr. Roosevelt did everything he could as governor. He thought up all sorts of things that no one had thought the government might do. Emergency relief administered by a very able man named Harry Hopkins. He put in place a program that he later imitated on the federal level, where young men went into the state parks and the forest of New York to do forestry and forest fire prevention and the like. Um, he said, we must try everything we can for the people of New York. Mr. Hoover, on the other hand, seemed just paralyzed. He tried a few things here and there, tinkering around the edges, but he got the idea in his head that it was more important to balance the budget than to extend relief. And by the summer of 1932, with unemployment at 25%, and the banking system so fragile and banks going bust all over the country, FDR knew the time had come for him to run for office, and he ran, promising a new deal for the American people. Well, it was a very exciting time. Our campaign theme, I know you know it, was "Happy Days Are Here Again." And that was the feeling of optimism that he carried as he went across the country campaigning, was very much like the optimism of the warm spring spirit that we had brought to the people suffering from polio down in Warm Springs. Well, he won in a landslide. He carried all but 6 states. In the state of South Carolina, he got 98% of the vote. I kept wondering who that 2% were, because I don't think Mr. Hoover has relations in South Carolina, but maybe it was postmasters, because when the president lost his job, they lost theirs. Anyway, we went into the White House. Now, you will recall that he took office in March of 1933. It's the last year when you had that long interregnum between election and taking office. That's our vocabulary word for the day, children, interregnum. But he took office, and right away he took action. He didn't even go to the inaugural balls. Mrs. Roosevelt and her children and some of the others like me represented him. He was busy swearing in his cabinet. And in the next 100 days, 15 major pieces of legislation were pushed through the Congress. The Emergency Relief Act, administered with our own Harry Hopkins, who came down from New York. The banking system was restructured and saved. Farm relief, farm overhauls, and then the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was really Mr. Roosevelt's pet project because he likes to say he is a tree farmer from New York. Well, and then the one other thing that I think was very clever, because it did bring happy days to so many people, was the Beer and Wine Tax Revenue Act. Now, you know that we had been suffering through Prohibition from 1920 on. Not everyone suffered, and I must say that Mr. Roosevelt never gave up his little happy hour, which he liked to call children's hour. But most people were having a hard time with it and drinking very bad beer and liquor. Well, and also it had put 500,000 people out of work, at least out of legal work, when Prohibition began. During the winter, the Congress, which was also Democratic by that point, had voted to pass the 21st Amendment, which would repeal the 18th Amendment, the only amendment ever to be repealed. But they had to get ratification by the states, and we did not know how long that would take. So Mr. Roosevelt convinced the Congress that they could modify the Volstead Act, which enforced Prohibition, to allow for the legal sale of light wine and 3.2% beer. So that was passed during the 100 days, and what do you know? The Bush Company comes up with this wonderful idea. They send a huge set of horses prancing down Pennsylvania Avenue, pulling the Clydesdales horses, so gorgeous. All right, so, well, I was just about to finish off with that and promise you that things are going to continue to get better, that Mr. Roosevelt wakes up every morning with more ideas than he knows what to do with, and then he has a staff meeting around his bed where we bombard him with others. And of course, the newspapers have their own suggestions too. But I can promise you, Mr. Roosevelt is already thinking about running for re-election. And when he does, I hope that he will win and that even more states will support him. So at this point, I'm going to make a minute costume change. I'm going to take off my hat, let my fox loose, and answer a few questions as Catherine Smith, Missy LeHand's biographer. Okay. All right. I can't wear the earmuffs with the hat because it doesn't fit. So, okay. How did I do with the Boston accent, the Massachusetts accent? Was it okay? All right, thumbs up. Good.
Yes.
Because I'm a Southerner. I have never lived anywhere except Georgia, my native state, and South Carolina. But fortunately, about 40 years ago, I had the good sense to marry a man whose entire family is from Massachusetts. So I have been exposed to that lovely Boston accent for many years at family reunions and with my father-in-law, and have been able to fake it pretty well. So, so thank you for the thumbs up. Let me tell you a little bit more about Missy, and then we'll take some questions, because I'm sure you have some. Marguerite LeHand was a most unusual person. She had a high school education, which was very advanced for her age, her time, because she graduated in 1917. Only about 10% of the American public had a high school education at that point, and in fact, Eleanor Roosevelt did not have one. She had gone to a school in England, a boarding school, and instead of allowing her to finish her senior year, her family had insisted she come home to make her debut so she could find a husband in her social class. So the fact that many of the people around FDR had no more than a high school education was not at all unusual at the time. Missy was very bright. She had a lot of street smarts. She was also very discreet and very loyal. And she had this unusual ability to almost read FDR's mind. It's been described as a relationship almost like a brother and sister or a set of twins, in that she understood him and read him better than anyone. And I think I could say probably a whole lot better than Eleanor did, because they really never understood each other that well. When she came into the White House in 1933, she was the female member of the four-person secretariat, and they were the people who ran the White House. I think it's kind of hilarious now when you look at how many people work for the president and how many people it takes to run the White House. They all have these obscure titles. Everyone is a senior something or other, and at least in the last presidency, they came and went so fast, you had a hard time keeping up with who was doing what, unless it was Jared Kushner, and he was like Missy. He apparently had to do everything. But the other three were Louis Howe, who had been FDR's political guru for many years, a man named Steve Early, who was his press secretary and was indeed the first modern press secretary, was very good at his job, and a fellow named Marvin McIntyre, who was a preacher's son from Kentucky, who was the appointment secretary and sort of the average Joe that they bounced their ideas off because he had none of his own. Missy was, as in New York, she lived in the White House as well as working there. She lived on the third floor and had a little suite of rooms. She was Eleanor Roosevelt's backup, because even though Eleanor gave up her teaching position when she became First Lady, she loved to travel. She loved to serve as FDR's eyes and ears all over the country, and indeed later all over the world. And she had her own pet causes too. So she always felt comfortable leaving Missy in charge, because she knew she would handle things the way Eleanor wanted them handled and would never try to usurp her position as the First Lady. Missy understood her place. She had the only office adjoining FDR's. They were connected by a doorway that didn't even have a threshold, so he could wheel his wheelchair in and out and could shout out to things to her as needed. She also operated what was considered a back door to his office. If anyone had a hard time getting an appointment with Marvin McIntyre, they would send word to just get in touch with Missy, and she would sneak you in through the back door. You went around the back of the White House, through the Rose Garden, through Missy's French doors, and then she'd sneak you in. That way, she introduced FDR to one of his most able associates and aides, who became a top lobbyist. He was also an Irish American. He had a wonderful voice. He could play the accordion and the guitar, and she brought him around one night to perform for FDR after dinner, and he liked him so much, Tommy came around and would tell Missy in the morning what was going on, what he'd heard on the street. Missy would go into FDR's office and says, Tommy's out here and he says this, this, and this. And FDR would say, oh, send Tommy in. Well, he became FDR's lobbyist on Capitol Hill and got some of the most important New Deal legislation pushed through, which he and his roommate Ben Cohen, in fact, drafted. They were kind of the Sparkle twins of the New Deal. Missy also was an advocate for Supreme Court justices. And when the nominee for Attorney General died on the way to the inauguration, she was the only one who could come up with a replacement, Homer Cummings, who became FDR's very able Attorney General. It's a little story about his first Attorney General nominee that always gives people a chuckle. He was a senator from Montana, Senator Walsh, a very able man, but he was in his 70s, and right before the inauguration, he had married a much younger woman, about half his age, a Cuban debutante, and on the way up on the train, he died and had a heart attack. So we can only imagine what might have been going on in his last minutes. Who knows? But Homer Cummings led the war on crime that began in 1933 after a massacre at the Kansas City train station. And over the next 2 years, they rubbed out all the big gangs. This was the war on crime led by his protege, J. Edgar Hoover. So anyhow, John Dillinger, all these gangsters we hear about fell to the war on crime in the early 1930s. So Missy continued working for FDR until 1941. She was in the June of that year. He had just gotten elected for his third term. She had a severe stroke. She mentioned her heart condition. She had a severe stroke that paralyzed her on one side and took away her her ability to speak. And she eventually went down to Warm Springs for rehab. That didn't help. And she went home to her family in Massachusetts, and there she died a few years later. She died in the summer of 1944. FDR took care of all of her medical expenses. He also bought a grave plot for her and her family at a beautiful cemetery in Chelsea, Mount Auburn Cemetery, which his family set up an endowment so they continue to pay for its upkeep today. And he put her in his will. She was the only person outside his family who had a bequest of any size. And he had stipulated the income of his estate each year would be divided equally between his widow and the woman he called my friend Marguerite A. LeHand for her medical care, and up to $1,000 a year for her living expenses. Now, by the time FDR died, Marguerite had died already, so there was no point really in this being the will, but he didn't change it. He had a conversation with his son James on the day of his fourth inauguration, when he was clearly dying himself, and said that his lawyer has given him such a hard time about the will when he changed it, he wasn't going to go to the trouble again. And he said to James, it's what I owed her. She served me for so well and for so long and asked for so little in return. So Missy was someone who was mentioned in every biography about FDR, but she was so discreet, never kept a diary, didn't make notes, had no plans of writing a memoir, that really she came down through history as sort of a mystery woman. And I expect that someone will ask me about just who she was and what she was to FDR. So who's going to have the courage to ask that question?
Okay, who was she and who was she to FDR?
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I'm always glad Missy's left the room because she'd be so embarrassed by that question. The answer is short as we don't know. But from my reading of all the letters that I could get hold of, talking to her family who were very helpful. She has two great nieces who have all her papers. You know, everything they learned was from their mothers, but they were all clear that she was not his mistress. In fact, she had a long-term romance almost through his entire presidency with a man named William C. Bullitt, who was the ambassador to the Soviet Union and later to France. And Missy's letters to Bullitt are part of his archive at Yale. It's obviously that she was sort of lovelorn about him, but it was also obvious she liked him a lot better when he was on his side of the Atlantic Ocean, because when he came over, he was a real player, and he was always trying to jockey for a better appointment. He wanted to be a cabinet member. FDR kind of dangled Secretary of the Navy in front of him, but never gave it to him. And I think that Missy finally got wise to him and just broke it off in a very abrupt way during the campaign of 1940. After her illness, Bullitt was very kind to her. He was one of the people who came and called on her in Massachusetts, wrote her off and sent her gifts and that sort of thing. And they sort of mended their fallout. He also was overseas and sent a really beautiful flower arrangement for her to her funeral. But the feeling I got was if there was ever a period when they were more than just a very devoted friends, and boss and secretary was during the time they were at Warm Springs, and prior to that, for several winters, FDR bought a houseboat called the Loroco and went down to the Palm Beaches and to the Florida Keys and tooled around in his boat, and Missy was his hostess. Now, he had lots of company. This was a very small boat, and one of his children, Elliot, wrote a tell-all book that all of the other children disavowed, where he suggested that he had seen Missy sitting on his father's lap in her nightgown, therefore she was his mistress. If you read the log of the Loroco, you see that everyone was in their pajamas and in their nightgowns. There was no room to do anything else. They would come out on deck at night and party and drink grog and play games, and then they all went to bed. So there's just really no way to know what she was to him other than just someone that they were very, very fond of each other and very close to each other and respected each other a lot. So I will leave it at that. Other questions? I see we got some chats. Do we have questions? Yes, Mount Auburn. That's right. Mount Auburn Cemetery is in Cambridge, not Chessie. Okay, I'm sorry. They're so close together, it's sometimes hard to keep it all straight. Other questions?
Anyone have a question? You want to unmute yourself and ask?
Stephanie?
Yes, I have a question. You know, Missy LeHand strikes me as part of a legion of dedicated single females who supported so many important men.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated. I enjoyed your
Yeah.
presentation quite a bit. Thank you so much. But I'm fascinated with the fact that she did not.
Thank you. I was glad to see you because you were laughing.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah,
But,
yeah,
you know,
yeah. I always like to find someone laughing.
she did not have a high school education, and yet seems to have been so intelligent in terms of how she helped him. And
She did have a high school education.
I'm sorry, I guess I misunderstood that from your presentation.
Yeah, she didn't have a college education, but she did have a high school education.
And
she was, obviously very, very intelligent.
And it strikes me as so reassuring that this was an age where it was what people could think as opposed to what they could say they had as credentials that would help
Right.
move forward, particularly for a woman.
Yeah, and that was, and Grace Tully, who succeeded Missy after her incapacitation, was the same way.
Mhm.
She had a high school education, a single lady, lived with her mother. And in fact, FDR kind of liked having staff that were single and at his beck and call. Louis Howe was married with children, but he just moved into the White House and left his wife up in New York. Steve Early had a family, but he was just, they basically all worked themselves to death. Harry Hopkins, his wife had died of cancer a couple of years after the presidency began. And Eleanor Roosevelt became the guardian of his daughter, Diana, who moved into the White House. She lived down the hall from Missy. And in 1940, FDR invited Harry to dinner one night. He wasn't feeling well, told him to come spend the night, and then he stayed for 3 years. He actually got married again and brought his new wife into the White House, and Eleanor had to put her foot down to that. She didn't like her. But it's true. It was people who were, Louis Howe was a genius, but no, he hadn't gone to Harvard. He met FDR when FDR was in the legislature in New York, and Louis was a reporter. And, he just said, hey, this is a guy that I want to latch on to. So,
I'm quite,
these people did not know each other because they all went to Harvard.
I'm quite struck by how you say Eleanor did not understand Franklin as much as Missy might have.
Mm-hmm.
But boy, do I give her credit for how she allowed space for that.
Yeah. It was a successful partnership, and he needed her as a test balloon and all the other things she did, and then he could just say, "Oh, my missus, I can't control her. I just, That's what she thinks, and that's the way it is. And sometimes it was something that he was kind of thinking about, and when it went over like a lead balloon, he could step away.
Blame her.
But Eleanor also did not have a good sense about when she should present ideas to him. He desperately needed his children's hours and times to relax and let his hair down. And she'd come barging in and say, Franklin, I want to talk to you about this. And sometimes he just threw her out, said, I don't want to talk about this. I'm having my cocktail party. You can either have a drink with us or get out. Eleanor was so driven and just had to pack every day with as much as she could, and good heavens, the things she accomplished, but just didn't have a good reading sometimes on how to manage him.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for your question. But it is important to remember this was Francis Perkins became the first labor secretary, cabinet secretary during FDR's time, and both Louis Howe and Missy hired lots of women to work in the White House. Herbert Hoover had an all-male staff, and Missy had 50 people working under her, most of whom were women. So she was really, and some of them were polio survivors, which I thought was really special. So, other questions?
Yes, we got cut off when you were talking about the Budweiser with the beer. Could you finish that little story?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, he convinced Congress to pass this Beer and Wine Revenue Act, the thing being we need to bring booze back now so we can replenish some of the excise taxes. Before Prohibition began, excise taxes made up to 40% of the federal budget. Now, they had passed the income tax amendment prior to that, so they started, making rich people pay income tax, and they didn't need it as much. But the Treasury was just getting emptied out. People weren't paying their taxes. So the excise tax that would come from beer and wine sales was, the pretext for passing this. Also, it put people back to work in the legal business of making beer. And it wasn't just beer, but truck drivers and barrel makers and all that. Of course, a lot of them had been in the underground economy of Prohibition all those years, illegally selling beer and driving trucks of it and that kind of thing. But it brought it back to the surface again. So the Budweiser Company was starting out with the Clydesdales, and this was the introduction of the Clydesdale horses, and they came to Washington pulling a beer wagon down Pennsylvania Avenue and delivered a case of Budweiser to the White House. They also sent their team up to New York City and delivered a case to Al Smith, who had run as a wet in 1928 and had been badly beaten. He was also a Catholic and also a creature of the New York City machine, Tammany Hall. And those things had sort of combined to defeat him.
Am I right in thinking that actually the Clydesdales and the wagon were given by the children of Anheuser-Busch as a gift after the thing was lifted on the beer and wine? And it was a gift from the children to him.
I had not heard that, but interesting.
Yeah.
I had not heard that. Interesting. We had the Clydesdales came to my city a number of years ago, and we had an old mule stable that was cleaned up to put them in, and they are really gorgeous, incredible, huge. Oh my God, their feet. Woo! You wouldn't want to get under one. Yeah.
Of course, I think Budweiser was making a near beer during the Prohibition as a substitute to keep them in business. Yeah.
A lot of companies did. I'm working on a book right now. Well, I've actually finished it. It's coming out in June, called Baptist and Bootleggers. And it's about the different forces that made Prohibition happen and then made it go away. But my story is called a Prohibition Expedition Through the South with cocktail recipes. Usually Prohibition focuses on northern cities, but the South went dry before the North. And what that meant is we got really good at rum running and making moonshine and all that stuff, so we could keep you folks lubricated after the rest of the country went dry. So Carrie Nation was a Southerner. She was from Kentucky. Al Capone traveled the South quite a bit and actually lived in Miami Beach in his last years, not counting the time he lived in Atlanta at the federal pen. So there's just a lot of famous figures in Prohibition who had a Southern connection. And then, man, we were just pumping out the moonshine and the rum. So anyway, that's coming out in June. That was fun to research.
The Roosevelt,
the book I wrote.
the Roosevelt family all seem to be very driven, and Eleanor actually was a Roosevelt too.
Right. She was from the Teddy Roosevelt side of the family.
Yeah, I often wondered how come Franklin ended up a Democrat when his cousin Theodore was actually a Republican.
Well, they were two wings of the family, and Franklin's father was a Democrat. Theodore, the Oyster Bay were the Republicans, and the Hyde Parks were the Democrats. So, two different sides. Eleanor was Teddy Roosevelt's favorite niece. Her father was his brother Elliot, who was a drunk and a wastrel, and she had a very, very sad childhood. And then she ended up marrying and having the mother-in-law from hell. So, yeah. But anyway, my book about Missy is called The Gatekeeper, and it's been out a few years. You can find copies of it very easily, both used and new. And if you're interested in her and also about the relationship she had with both Eleanor and Franklin and their families, I recommend it, of course. I also write a mystery series, a Missy LeHand mystery series with a co-author. And we put Missy in all these situations, some of which she was really in and some we make up, but we also gave her a really nice boyfriend because, and I told the great nieces I was going to do that, and they were all for it. They said Missy deserved a nice boyfriend. She never had one in real life. So we hook her up with this really nice and very handsome FBI agent. But there are 4 of them. You can find them on Amazon as Kindle books or paperbacks. It's the Missy LeHand Mystery Series, and I write them with a guy named Kelly Durham. There's one called that Eleanor Roosevelt Goes to Prison that's set in Warm Springs, and it's the one that has the most Eleanor Roosevelt as a character in it. Other questions? Now, how far is Boston from where you folks are?
25, 30 miles.
Oh, okay. So you're really close. Well, if you've not been to Mount Auburn before, it's a fabulous place to visit. I'm a real cemetery buff. In fact, in my new book, I have a cemetery side trip in every chapter, so you can find the graves of bootleggers and prohibitionists and temperance workers and that kind of thing. And some of them are really weird graves. But Mount Auburn is just so pretty. And Missy's is very easy to find. She's got a big pink boulder at her grave. Yes, Miss Joanne?
My parents are buried at Mount Auburn, and it is very cemetery.
Yeah, they do a lot of educational programs there too.
And it's a beautiful cemetery just to walk through. All different types.
Yeah. It was the first of the garden cemeteries, is my understanding, and eventually all over the country, major cities have these beautiful garden cemeteries with beautiful statuary and the like. So. Someone else said something?
I was just going to say it's beautiful in the spring with all the blossoms, the rhododendrons, azaleas. It's absolutely gorgeous.
I
and
can
just
imagine.
to ride through, if people can't walk, the ride through it's because it's huge.
Well, we have one in Braintree called the Blue Hill Cemetery that is quite nice to go through. And at Christmas time, they have quite a display.
Yeah. I think it's kind of interesting what they've been doing with these historic cemeteries. There's one called Elmwood that's in Memphis, and they have programming. They have movie night at the cemetery, and haunted night tours. And there's one in Louisville where they have a distiller's tour, and they'll come, take you around in a wagon and tell you all the story of the dead distillers that are buried there, and there are a whole lot of them, as you can imagine. Anyway, that's it's one way. These places all have endowments, and they all are having challenges with maintenance, and that's one way to keep them up, because the family members are not always around anymore to do it. So, any other questions, folks? Okay. Well, thank you. I've enjoyed this, and I hope you have too. And I hope I'll get to Zoom with some of you again someday. I do several other talks, so if Jean finds anything else I talk about that might be interesting, I'll come Zoom with you again.